Get started. Thank you all again for joining us. Today, we're marking the 10th anniversary of the Panama Papers investigation. For those of you who might not know ICIJ, we're the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. We're a global nonprofit newsroom that spearheads cross-border investigations, collaborating with media partners around the world to expose corruption, financial crime, and broken systems. 10 years ago this week, 376 journalists from every corner of the globe came together to publish the Panama Papers, an investigation based on 11.5 million leaked records from the offshore law firm Mossack Fonseca. The reporting exposed how politicians, billionaires, and criminals use secret companies and offshore structures to hide their wealth and avoid scrutiny. That investigation sparked protests, criminal investigations, and reforms across dozens of countries and created a new model for collaborative journalism. Today, we're stepping back to ask two big questions. What changed after the Panama Papers and what hasn't? I'm Carmen Molina Costa. I'm ICIJ's digital producer, and I'll be leading today's conversation. Joining us today is ICIJ's executive director, Gerard Ryle, who led the global collaboration behind the Panama Papers, and Tove Maria Ryding, a leading international expert on tax justice and financial transparency. She spent years pushing governments to address weaknesses in the global financial system. Before joining ICIJ as director in 2011, Gerard spent more than 20 years working as an investigative journalist in Australia and his native Ireland. His work has won or shared part in over 50 journalism awards, including the Pulitzer Prize that ICIJ received in 2017 for the Panama Papers. Tova is the Policy and Advocacy Manager for Tax Justice at the European Network on Debt and Development. She's also a member of the coordinating committees of the Financial Transparency Coalition and the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. We're really grateful she agreed to join us today for this important conversation. Before we start, I do want to let you all know that this webinar is being recorded. If you have questions, please feel free to submit them using the function on your screen. We're going to do our best to get to as many of them as possible during our Q&A section later. So in the interest of covering as much ground as possible, let's get started. Gerard, I'm going to begin with you. Today, the Panama Papers is widely viewed as a turning point in the global conversation about financial secrecy. When you first saw the documents over 10 years ago, what were you thinking? Were you aware that it would have that kind of impact?
My biggest concern at the time was that we had done a number of stories about offshore tax havens, and my big fear was that the reporters that we started approaching would think that we had done it before, and that there was nothing new here. But the size and the scale of the documents, I mean, the fact that we had like 200,000 in the end, 200,000 secret offshore companies, made me believe that, when you have secrets, there's always a potential for wrongdoing, and we needed to expose it. So it was a mixture of, I guess, anxiety, but also excitement, because here we had a real chance to open something new.
Did you foresee the sort of impact that would have, how big it would be?
Absolutely not. No, when we started, we had a lot of doubts. There were a lot of doubts in the team. When we first gathered the reporters together, our first meeting was in Washington, D.C. at the National Press Club, and we had about 35 people turn up to it. And even they were doubting what was in there, because at that point, what people don't seem to realize is that we didn't get all the documents together in one go. We started getting we had about 1 million from a first source, and then this John Doe, the famous John Doe character, appeared and then started producing more documents for us. By the time we had that first meeting, we only had about 2.5 to 3 million documents, which sounds like a lot. But given that we had done a previous project with 2.5 million documents, it seemed like, maybe it was just a slightly better than the last one and not good enough. But then every month, John Doe continued to send more and more documents. And we pretty much had 1 million documents coming in a month until we got to the point where we said, please stop sending us stuff. We have to analyze these documents. Because, of course, every time you got a new set of documents, you had to begin again. You had to look for all of the names and all of the things that you could see in the documents. So pretty much every time, a new set of documents came, you had to reset and start again and convince all the reporters to do that work again.
What made you realize that this was sort of different than previous investigations?
I think it was really the collaboration that was going on behind the scenes. We built an online newsroom for all of the reporters to come together, and we ended up with 376 reporters, all working together. It was the fact that they started seeing things that um, led to clusters of information. For instance, they started seeing sports stars that were putting their image rights into offshore companies, and we figured at that point that they were avoiding taxes doing this. And it really started with one reporter seeing one famous sports star. And then, of course, the other reporters decided to look for the famous people in their country. And eventually that became a theme. And this was happening in multiple areas. We started seeing, prime ministers, politicians, major business figures. And of course, here was another cluster of potential stories that we were looking at. And in the end, that was really the magic because it was the reporters finding things in their own country and we all putting that together for a global story that really had that impact. Um, but right to the very end, there was a lot of doubt, was this as big as we thought it was? Because John Doe was very anxious for some reason for us to have a very large media partner in the United States. We were working at that point with the Miami Herald and McClatchy. This apparently wasn't good enough for John Doe. He wanted 60 Minutes or something bigger. So one of my jobs was to go to 60 Minutes every month or two with an update on how we were going. But their reaction to the story was actually putting doubts in my head because it just didn't seem to think that we had a good enough story for them. And, I think in the end, of course, it worked fantastically well. But I think what people have to realize is that we really didn't know ourselves until we published how big this was going to be.
Yeah, so what was that like for you to go from having these doubts internally and also having done also previous investigations like offshore leaks into the offshore world and having Panama Papers really sort of explode internationally once it was published?
Look, we had amazing faith in the story ourselves. All of the reporters that were really working hard on this had enormous faith all the way through. So there were no doubts on our side. It was just that we were wondering how the world would view what was happening. I think the moment for me, the moment of clarity was when we published one of the big names we had, and we had it from the very beginning, was the Prime Minister of Iceland. And when images came through of the Parliament building in Iceland being surrounded by people who were throwing yogurt and banana at the building and demanding the resignation of this prime minister. That was the big moment. And at that moment too, the story went from page 3 in the New York Times to page 1 across the world. And everything to do with Panama Papers after that moment became really big news. So it wasn't just the media that we were working with that were working on the story at that point. It was every single journalist in the world because they were all looking for an angle to the Panama Papers. And we were publishing documents and they were finding things that we didn't see when we were working on it privately. So more and more stories kept coming out.
Tove, I'm going to kick it to you. How is it, as somebody who works and is an expert in tax justice and transparency efforts, what was it like for you to see the Panama Papers come out?
Yeah, how to capture that? I think the Panama Papers was it was the moment where your friends and family stopped asking, why do you what do you work on? Tax and transparency, and why is that important? I think before that, people asked if you could help them with the tax return and didn't quite understand why there was such a big problem to spend so much time on. And suddenly it was the moment where everyone firstly said, okay, I see what you're doing. I see why it's important, but also just the public support for addressing this issue became enormous. It was the feeling of explaining a taxi driver on the way to the airport what I did for a living and getting a hug at the end. It was the public momentum was so tangible and it was so global because it was a very global story. Suddenly, all around the world, there was an extreme awareness. And secondly, also, of course, the political momentum was we saw all around the world, including also in Brussels, where I live, we saw that things that we had asked for, where decision makers had said no, suddenly the issue, they themselves took it up and suddenly started following our recommendations. So you felt the change in political momentum from one day to the next. And of course, it's also meant that more tax money got collected and laws have changed and some loopholes have been closed. But the public awareness is also something that now, even 10 years later, we still feel it.
Yeah, could you walk me through some of what changed? What actually got changed?
So one of the things we saw in the Panama Papers was the creative ways in which you can use anonymous companies. Basically, if you want to hide money, you want to control the money, you want to have access to it, but you don't want your name on it. And the use of shell companies, that really became a very, very big issue, together with also a recognition of the enormous creativity and the complexity of these structures. And we had actually said here in Brussels, right before, we had said we want to have transparency around who owns what company. And they had negotiated a money laundering directive, and they had not picked up on this. And they had just finished the negotiations. And then came the Panama Papers, and they reopened the whole anti-money laundering directive and negotiated a new directive simply because suddenly everyone thought, okay, anonymous companies, that constitutes a very, very risky issue for our entire society.
Yeah, a quick question going back to Gerard, which was as an investigative journalist and somebody who was, part of this huge collaboration, what was it like to watch sort of the ramifications of the investigation kind of unfold in real time?
Yeah, I think the biggest surprise we had at that point was the anger that people had. There were demonstrations in the streets across the world and in places you weren't expecting, like in Pakistan and London. And I think, my reaction was that I think we were confirming what people already knew in their hearts, but didn't have the proof of. And here we were presenting the proof, and everyone was going, yes, I knew that there was one system for the rich and one system for us. And that made them very angry. And I think the reason that the politicians reacted so strongly and so quickly to change things is that they could see the danger here. Here was, if you want to get things changed, make people angry. And people were incredibly angry. And that was gratifying. I cannot explain how gratifying that was for the reporters who had worked on this, in secrecy for a year, who, had to grapple with all the doubts, who were internally fighting over what this document meant and what that document meant. Um, you know, to see this kind of result was a kind of a unique thing for journalism.
Yeah, going back to Tova really quick. What we talked a bit sort of about the public reaction, right? And the ripple effect and how it changed sort of the public conversation. How did it change conversations sort of internally in the space of transparency and tax and that world that you work in?
Well, I mean, suddenly we went from trying to convince policymakers to actually discussing exactly how should the laws be constructed to stop this problem. But also on the issue of the public anger, I think there is another important aspect to keep in mind is also that the Panama Papers exposed some secrets of the world's most powerful people. And I think we also internally in the community really understood the courage it took to come out with the Panama Papers. And really, I think it's important to say there was a huge appreciation of ICIJ's work, both in terms of the skills. One thing is the magnitude of the documents, but they were also very technically complex. So picking all that apart, digging out the stories and making sure that everything was bulletproof and really understanding things in such depth, it was really because we also go in depth sometimes and we recognized, okay, this is very, very professional work that ICIJ has put into it. But we also know that it takes courage. It's very difficult to go out and challenge some of the world's most powerful people. So we were very astonished. And the last thing also about the conversation is that it became much easier to explain that corruption is not just something that happens in a few countries in the global south. Suddenly, everyone saw that actually corruption is a problem all around the world. If we don't have transparency and accountability, then it's going to impact all of us. And it was a very important time.
Yeah, going back to Gerard, sort of building off of that, the collaborative element, sort of the technical finesse that you mentioned, Tova, was sort of needed to get this project done. Gerard, can you talk to us a bit about the level of collaboration that was necessary? It was one of the largest investigative collaborations.
Yeah, well, we needed to make sure that everybody we brought into the circle, could be trusted, and we had built trust over a number of years working on smaller projects. For us, it was the most important thing. I mean, there were two rules only that we had at the beginning, which was that we were going to have to share everything you saw. You had to share with your colleagues right away, no matter how important or unimportant it was. And the second thing was that you had to have that trust that we were all going to publish together at exactly the same moment in time. And I also think that one of the other amazing aspects of this was when you have so many reporters looking at these documents, it was going to be very difficult afterwards for anyone to criticize the reporting because we had all come to the same conclusion. And I think that was one of the differences between this and some other journalism in that when we came out with it, it was very difficult for anyone to say you got that wrong or you got this wrong. I mean, I'm very grateful, Tove, that you mentioned that the accuracy. I mean, I was paranoid about one thing, and that was accuracy. I remember at one point, very close to the end of the project, I could hardly sleep. And I remember thinking, well, we just needed to bring it one more notch up. And I remember walking into Marina Walker's room, and she was obviously manning up the phones and contacting people and talking to people every day and doing the day to day. And I just wrote down one thing, one mistake. That's all I wrote, and I walked out and sent her into a complete panic. And she sent everyone else into a panic in the team because we went back and we wanted to double check everything. Now, we did make small mistakes. I mean, I remember we clearly made a mistake in the editing with one of the biggest revelations there was the family of the then Prime Minister of Pakistan. And we found that his children owned property in London. And in our story, in the editing, we actually changed it saying that he owned the property. Now it was his young children who owned the property, and that was a mistake. So where small things got through, but generally speaking, hardly any mistakes were made, if any, that I'm aware of, apart from that one. And that was important because it added to the credibility of what we were doing.
Totally. Um, Tova, going back to you, what, again, as sort of we've mentioned, the offshore world is sort of a game of manipulating loopholes. What are some of the biggest loopholes over the past 10 years that you've seen sort of successfully closed?
We made a lot of progress on anonymous shell companies. At one point, it actually looked like we would get public registers of company owners. Then in the EU, they backtracked on that, and there's been discussions about data privacy. We still believe that the right to own a company anonymous is it doesn't make sense. But we have seen a lot of progress when it comes to companies. And then we also said, well, but the obvious alternative is trusts. You can move your money to trusts instead. And here I would say that luckily ICIJ did not stop working after the Panama Papers. We got the Paradise Papers and we got the Pandora Papers, actually also showing how the money was moving into mega trusts and new type of structures. And that then helped to get a political momentum to do more on trusts. So there has been a lot of loopholes closed. There's a long way to go, and it's chasing the money that keeps running from one loophole to the next. But especially also this, as Gerald said, also that people had a feeling that something was wrong, but now there was really concrete evidence, and that's really been important for upholding the momentum. So we have seen a number of steps forward. The most important one, I would say, is the fact that there's public awareness.
Yeah, what would you say are the loopholes that are still open that we need to work on?
Changes all the time. Crypto assets was one that we didn't have on our radar just a decade ago, but that one's come up very big. And then it's very interesting to see the creativity in the secrecy jurisdictions as well. There are different types of free ports, is like a luxury basement where you can hide paintings and gold bars, and so we're up against a constantly evolving environment. But and also the other challenge we have is that not all countries cooperate. And one of the things we saw, unfortunately, was that the United States was very determined to expose American citizens that hide wealth abroad. And they collect a lot of information about American citizens. But at the same time, foreign citizens can come to the US and hide assets. And so the problem that's also become very clear over the last 10 years is that we do still have some countries that aren't cooperating in the way that they should, unfortunately.
Is there any progress being made that we should keep an eye on?
Absolutely. I think we've been pursuing this issue, and one of the things that we have called for is just like we have a UN Convention on climate change, we need a UN Convention on tax justice. We need to make sure that the world's richest and big multinational corporations start paying their share. And in relation to that, the secrecy jurisdictions are, of course, essential because you can't tax something if you don't know who owns what. And in 2022, the UN decided to start a negotiation about a new legally binding agreement on the international tax cooperation. So this is a huge move forward. And for the first time, it allows all the countries that are losing out to come together and find each other and start cooperating on pushing back and introducing transparency and justice. So this negotiation is going on right now, and that's one reason why we are very hopeful that we can see much more progress over the coming years.
So you do feel hopeful.
Very much, very much. But my hope relies on the fact that we have to remember, we have to keep awareness around this issue, and we have to flag that the job is still not finished. But seeing the negotiations move forward and also seeing all the countries that aren't secrecy jurisdictions, that they are only losing out because of these problems, seeing them speak out, seeing them push for progress. The Africa Group has played a very impressive role in saying our continent cannot afford to lose these resources. And seeing this momentum has really been very, very encouraging. There's a lot of work to be done, including on writing a strong and ambitious convention. But it's great that we have this breakthrough, and it does create hope for the future.
How about you, Gerard? Looking back on 10 years of not just Panama Papers, but the investigations that followed, like Tova mentioned, Paradise Papers, Pandora Papers, and sort of the reforms that have unspooled afterwards. How does it feel to look back on that?
Yeah, look, I think the issues that end up getting attention from politicians are the issues that won't go away. And I think it was very important for us to follow up with Paradise Papers and with Pandora Papers. I mean, Pandora Papers were even bigger than Panama Papers in terms of size, in terms of number of documents, in terms of the number of reporters working on it. Um, but I'll make some other points. I mean, I think too, probably the biggest blow that we delivered is the fear of the unknown in the future. They don't know whether we're going to come back and do this again, whether we're going to find another document set that's going to prove through more wrongdoing. I think we also had enormous fun doing the follow-up, the next project, because what we found with each new document set that we managed to get a hold of, we found what they were changing in order to continue the secrecy. They were changing their deliberately allowing clients to misspell their names, for instance, so that they could um, comply with the new laws that were coming in. But in other words, just finding, like Tove said, like finding clever ways to keep it all going. And it was very interesting as a journalist to see them doing this in real time. I mean, it was all very interesting to see all the reactions to our work each time we got a new set of documents, because they were talking about us all the time and working out how to counter us and how to counter the publicity. So that was also very gratifying. So I think, the biggest fear for the future is that we will do this again. And of course we would, if we managed to get a hold of the right set of documents. So if there's anyone out there, yeah.
Yeah, as you guys have both said, it's a system that's constantly changing and evolving and loopholes opening and closing. From a journalistic perspective, how do you keep up with it?
Like Tuffa said, I think the biggest issue right now is cryptocurrency, because that is essentially the latest version of the offshore world. It's the latest version of secrecy. Because if you think about everything we were doing, there was one thing at the center of everything, and that was secrecy. The governments couldn't react because they didn't know how to react, because they didn't know what was going on. And so if you can continue to attack secrecy, that to me is you're attacking corruption. But as long as there are new ways to hide things, then people will always use those new ways. And it really is up to the politicians to keep up, and up to journalists too, to continue to report on this. One of the beauties about being a nonprofit, compared to working in a big media company, is that when you work for a big media company, you will often get your editors to say, look, you've done this story before. I mean, I go back to the beginning of Panama Papers, when one of our media partners was skeptical of us doing this, because I said, well, we've already done offshore leaks, which, we've done Luxembourg leaks, we've done these kind of projects before. Why do you think this one is different? And the answer is because we're revealing, new levels of secrecy, and we should keep going. That was my answer.
Why is the collaborative model that Panama Papers sort of pioneered, why is that so instrumental and important in investigations like these about secrecy?
Well, it gives you the resources that you don't have these days. I mean, the business models that have sustained this kind of reporting are are in big trouble around the world. The big media companies aren't making money anymore the way they used to, so they're not willing to invest the kind of thing, the kind of investments you need to make to do this kind of work. So by bringing reporters together, it's a very cost-effective model for getting this work done. Because if you can bring 80, I think we had reporters from 80 different countries here, the 107 different media organizations. We were all contributing to the one big push to get the story out. And it was very, very cost effective. So I think in terms of collaboration, we also learned that by sharing a story, you do end up with a much better story at the end than the old traditional model, a reporter working by herself or himself and getting the scoop. I mean, here we all had scoops in every country, and each scoop led to another scoop, which led to even a bigger story again. So we showed that by working together, it's a very feasible and cost-effective way of working.
Gerard, do you have any favorite memories or favorite like stories that came out of the Panama Papers?
Look, my favorite story was happened a week before publication. We had gone to a lot of the people for comment, because we'd come to a conclusion in terms of what they had done, but we wanted to make sure that we had both sides of the story. So we went to the Prime Minister of Iceland, for instance, and we interviewed him, and we'd put all the allegations to him. But we also had this big dilemma in that we had discovered about $20 billion going through offshore accounts, all linked to a person in Moscow who was a cello player in an orchestra there. And when we first put the name to our Russian colleagues, they said this guy is a nobody. And but if it turned out that we found out that he was in fact the godfather of Vladimir Putin's child, and so we had to put the allegations to Putin or to the Kremlin, and we sat down, we wrote a big long letter, And my favorite moment came then because the Kremlin, 1 week from publication, called a press conference, said there was going to be a big attack, information attack on Russia, and named us. And it was the best thing he could have ever done because it set a scene for the story itself, but it also removed any of the doubts that the editors had around the world that this was a big story. When you had the leader of Russia saying that something major was about to happen, that for me was the best moment because it created an audience for us, but it also eliminated any doubt. And then there was some panic at the time. People thought, okay, the story's out, we have to publish right away. But I mean, I just thought to myself, this is a godsend. We'll stick to our schedule. We have another week to go. We'll finish our stories, make sure they're right. And the Kremlin had just given us the best possible publicity for what we were about to do. My favorite moment.
Wow, that really shows like the international scope. Um, Tova, going back to, I know we've talked a bit about sort of the current climate around transparency and a bunch of initiatives that the US used to be at the forefront of have sort of faltered a bit. Can you speak a little bit to sort of what that means on an international level?
Yes, absolutely. I think, I mean, the US, speaking of news media, the US US is a big discussion at the moment, and a lot of people are talking about the crisis of multilateralism. But actually, what we see is the vast majority of the world's countries that really want to work together and stop this international problem. And if anything, the spirit of collaboration seems to be strengthened by the fact that it's so obvious that there are some problems with individual countries, but with a real minority of countries. So I think the awareness about the fact that actually, if the vast majority of the world's countries stand together, they can also put in place conditions saying that if you want to operate in my country, you have to abide by my laws. And that way, this whole spirit of collaboration between all the countries losing out, that is a very, very important moment. And in some absurd ways, you can even say that some of the news from the US actually helps make the rest of the world understand, okay, we're on our own, we have to move. But it's also very true, I think, what Gerard says, and that's also one thing we learned from ICIJ is that there's also an awareness about the fact that the journalists can work together. And I think this was really also a real strong impact of the Panama Papers was exactly that it was so opposite of what you see so often where a journalist wants to keep the story for themselves. Suddenly, there was a collaboration that made it much more powerful, much more well informed, but also really showed that these journalists are really working together in the service of the truth and of the story, and that becomes the essence. And it, of course, also indeed made it much more difficult to be reckoned with. But also in a time where news media had become very top level, and whenever we went to media and tried to talk about tax and transparency, they often told us this is way too technical. Suddenly, you could point to ICIJ and say, look how cool you can look if you actually manage to look into this and crack all these facts. And I think we saw after the Panama Papers, suddenly journalists were really looking for tax stories. We still benefit a bit from that today. And that also means it's very true what Gerard says that the deterrent effect of the Panama Papers is still there today. There is a different risk associated with hiding your money and engaging in all these corrupt structures today because you never know whether your secret will be kept. The ITH has made it easy to hide money, but it's also made it very easy to leak information. So I concur. If anyone has anything out there, please send it to Gerard. And it's very important that this accountability continues.
Yeah, building off of that, a question for Gerard. What, how how did the world of journalism change as a result of the Panama Papers? Because, like we said, it was sort of a new type of investigative journalism.
I think it became cool to collaborate. People realized that if you work with a TV station and a newspaper and a radio station, like we were doing in every country, that the story got much more amplification. And I think they began to realize too that if you share a story, you end up with a much better story together than if you had kept that lone wolf model that Tove mentioned, you know. That was the biggest change for us. It also, of course, meant that there were a lot more people doing this kind of work. We weren't the only ones in the space anymore. But I think that is a sign of success, and I applaud it rather than, you know, go against it. Um, you know, but also I think, you know, it was almost like, you know, I'm old, okay, but I grew up with, you know, the idea of the, you know, the hero journalist, you know, the Watergate. I think it was a Watergate moment of our time. And I think it became, you know, cool to be a journalist again if you were an investigative reporter and you were revealing things that people didn't want revealed. Because one of the things that we were revealing was the hypocrisy of the politicians and of the world leaders, because some of these people had campaigned against offshore tax havens. I'm thinking in particular of David Cameron in the UK. You know, for when we published Offshore Leaks in 2013, for instance, he was one of the world leaders that came out and said, this needs to stop. We need to do something about um, all of these small islands that are able to do this kind of work. Of course, a lot of them being former British colonies, which is why he was talking about it. But then to find that his father had set up an offshore structure which David Cameron himself was benefiting from, was a real political crisis in the UK, but it pointed to that hypocrisy. And also the Prime Minister of Iceland, I mean, he had come out in, you know, attacking offshore structures while he himself was, you know, the beneficiary of this offshore, you know, secret company that he had set up with his wife. So again, I think, again, going back to people felt there was something wrong, and here was the evidence it was wrong.
Absolutely, yeah. So, like, again, sort of looking back on those, the 10 years that have passed, right? What, for people who maybe weren't, paying attention in 2016, 2017, or, are now coming of age and like maybe don't really remember the impact it had. And this is a question for both of you, so maybe you can take it first, Jared, and then we'll kick it to Tova. What lesson do you want people to still keep in mind? Why does the Panama Papers still matter in today's world?
Well, I think it matters to reveal, you know, to hold power to account would be my answer there. It's very important that journalists have a role. I mean, I think over the years, while the business model for journalism was producing so much money for the business owners, we kind of forgot what our real role was. And our real role is to be on the side of the public, you know, to reveal things of public interest. I think that is the legacy that we want to see going forward. I mean, it brings it back to what is our real job? Our real job is to work for the public.
Tova?
The power of transparency, indeed. Rather than asking our politicians to promise us that the problems will be fixed and everything will be fantastic. Transparency is a way for the public to keep the decision makers to account. And it's very, very important to note that the Panama Papers went into the decision-making rooms. There were power holders that were writing the laws, and at the same time they were exposed. So the power of transparency, I think we still have a very long way to go on that. But it's very, very important that we are able to double check what's going on. And I would also say the power of journalism and the importance of also protecting journalism and whistleblowers and really ensuring that there are people that are able to do the job to hold the world's most powerful to account. And maybe that's the last thing that also has changed, unfortunately, is that we used to say that when people become extremely rich, it will one day become a democratic problem. We've changed the way we talk about this, and we say it has become a democratic problem, that there are people who are so crazy rich. Within the next years, or perhaps even this year, we're headed towards having the first trillionaire on the planet. And there isn't a democracy strong enough to resist when someone becomes so rich and so powerful. So it is very important in our view to also make sure that we fight inequality and that we regain a balance in our democracy. But a very important part of this is the first step is just for the public to be able to see what's going on. So transparency is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, Tova, is there anything sort of on the horizon or that, civil society groups are working towards that you feel would be really like the kind of turning point that you guys are advocating for, whether that's the UN tax convention or like the OECD's work on a global minimum tax for corporations? Is anything in that realm that, you really would think would be sort of a watershed moment?
Yeah, I think there's a big difference between those two. OECD minimum tax and there's been a lot of OECD decisions, and we would say that the fact that we had the problem that the Panama Papers exposed wasn't because there weren't any standards. There's always been lots of standards, lots of changes. It was because they weren't strong and ambitious and solid enough. So, and that's where the UN Tax Convention is a very different way of working. First and foremost, the negotiations are transparent, they're live streamed. We can check what our governments are saying on our behalf. Civil society and parliamentarians can all be in the room. And so having transparency in the decision making on transparency is already a very important step forward. And then in the UN Tax Convention negotiations, we're also very happy that the mandate says that the objective is to create an international tax system for sustainable development. And that's where we need to link back to the issues of development, education, healthcare, environmental protection. We need to make sure that we get a tax and finance system that doesn't go counter to all the things that our governments have decided and confirmed that we should achieve. It shouldn't go counter to the public interest. It should be in the service of sustainable development and progress. So the fact that we're starting to link the issues of tax and transparency to all the other things that have been decided at the United Nations, human rights and sustainable development and so forth, that for us has really been a missing link. And that means that now we can also see the negotiations on these issues, they get held to account in relation to all the other things that our governments have committed to. So we see that as a game changer in terms of how decisions are made, but we're not there yet. We still need to write this amazing UN tax convention, and that's going to happen over the next year. So we're actually in a very, very crucial and important moment.
Sounds like an exciting time. All right. I think I see we have a lot of questions from our audience, so I'm going to turn to the Q&A now. If anybody has a question they'd like to submit and wants to do so now, please go ahead. This first one I'm going to point to Gerard, which is what evidence is most effective in verifying beneficial ownership when individuals deny links to offshore entities identified in the Panama Papers? And how do investigators distinguish between legitimate shell companies and those used for illicit activities?
I think the focus, well, I know the focus we had were not on, individuals that nobody had ever heard of. They were really on public figures. And what was beautiful about the documents is that we had all of all of the trail, I guess, from the moment that either they or the representatives approached Mossack Fonseca for a shell company, and they were able to see either in the documents or outside the documents what was happening with that shell company. So it was the paper trail that was unique here.
Tova, this next one I'm going to ping to you. Is there real political will to address these issues, or are arguments around privacy being used to limit meaningful reform?
Yes, to both of those. We do see a lot of political will to act, but it's directly linked to the public pressure. So, in fact, we see sometimes you could see that there's an ICIJ exposure, and then suddenly the will to act goes up immediately, and then it starts going down again. But no, there is a very strong awareness also from the side of governments that this issue has to be addressed. It's unsustainable, and governments still want to be seen taking action on this, but we need to make sure that we hold them to account. And then indeed, there's been an emerging discussion now about the data privacy. And one of the things we've seen a lot is that there's supposedly, if you have a public register of who owns what, there is the fear that there will be kidnappings. And the first thing is to say, well, just because if you own a company, your name has to be in a public register without the bank account of that information of that company or anything like that, but just we need to know who is behind this company name. We don't see that as a risk of kidnapping, and we haven't heard of any examples of this happening. Um, and in fact, you can say signs of wealth are exposed in many ways. We see wealthy people flying into space or buying luxury yachts, and there are many expressions of wealth. But having to put yourself down as the owner of a company, just so we can link the company to the person behind, we don't see that as a risk of kidnapping for sure. But it has been a very big part of the debate also here in Brussels. And at the moment, we have seen some setbacks because of data privacy. So, so there, our point is also that, of course, we shouldn't go too far. And I think that's exactly also the kind of dilemmas that ICIJ had when looking at the data is how much is okay to publish and what is also a legitimate privacy concern. So we should have full respect for data privacy. It's very important also to us. And we have to find the right limit between making sure that we respect data privacy, but also making sure that we don't allow secrecy to a level where our tax laws become ineffective, corruption becomes unstoppable, and even international sanctions become impossible to uphold. So that's the balance that we have ahead of us.
On the topic of data, Gerard, this next one's for you. How has the landscape of big data leaks changed since the Panama Papers?
Well, look, I think what the fact that it showed that, anyone can take data. I mean, as Tove mentioned, everything is digitized these days. It's an enormous opportunity for journalists, but also for people who want to expose corruption. Um, it's strange. We started getting more and more data sets afterwards, but then in recent times that has disappeared. There are lots of different reasons for that, I think. Some of them being that people realized that these data sets were actually very valuable and that there was a market for them elsewhere other than for journalism. And so we found that a lot of the data that we may have got in the past are now going and being, sold behind closed doors to governments. Um, uh, but in terms of, how has journalism changed from this? I think it was the early days of machine learning and the modern era of artificial intelligence that we had learned how to search big document sets using machines. And it was the beginning of a new kind of journalism. And I think it's going to continue to grow. I mean, I'm very excited by that because I do think that we can, the more of the sort of mundane tasks you can get rid of, the better the journalism can be in the end, and the more work we can do to put context around things, as Tova mentioned, which I think is very, very important.
Yeah, we actually got a question about AI. which to you again, Jared. Do you think that AI could have helped more your research 10 years ago, and have you applied these tools to a similar set of large documents since?
Yeah, we are experimenting all the time with AI. We do think it's going to be a very useful tool. But in terms of if we, I mean, one of the biggest issues, and I've said it several times, we couldn't afford to make a mistake. So we had to have human eyes on the material. We had to verify everything. And I don't think you can use a shortcut for that. Um, and I'm sure there are things we could do. Like, as I said, once we learned that was a certain type of document in the system, our very clever engineers worked out a way of finding other documents like that, which then helped the reporters. But at the end of the day, each reporter had to sit down and go through the documents themselves to verify that, in fact, what we thought was actually happening, because we could not afford to make a mistake. Because if we had, we would, the whole project would have fallen down.
Now, a question for Tova, which is who are the key political leaders in the US, globally, sort of driving these tax reforms and working towards those policies?
Fantastic. No, that's a very important question. And this is actually also a historic change. In the past, the decision making on issues like transparency and taxation have very much been driven by the world's richest countries. It was very much the G7, and Gerard mentioned Cameron, and it was a very small club of countries that made the decisions that impact all of us. And we had been saying for many years it's important for all countries to be at the table and on an equal footing. The United Nations is the only place where that's actually the case, and we also saw how important it is to have that when what happened in 2022 was that the Africa Group teamed up and said, enough, we want to stop illicit financial flows. We want to change the system. This is urgent. We're losing very large sums of money, both because individuals and because multinational corporations are not paying their share of taxes. So they pushed ahead. And then the other developing countries came in and supported them. And it caused complete confusion in the global north. First, the EU voted against, and there were some countries like Norway and Iceland abstained at the UN General Assembly. And then the EU got more and more confused, and also internally in the EU, there were a number of countries that actually do lose out a lot because of illicit financial flows. And suddenly they started hesitating and saying, well, actually, maybe this is not such a bad idea. So first the EU voted against, and then the year after they abstained, and then when the negotiations started, they all came to the table. So it's been a type of reform driven by the Africa Group and the Global South that we haven't seen before. But one thing we have seen before that we also saw here was the United States getting up and leaving the room. And that's unfortunately quite common in all sorts of international negotiations. It's also happened at the OECD several times. But the important thing here is that what sometimes happens is that the United States likes to write the rules, and then when it comes to following the rules, then they leave. Here, the United States left before the rules were written, and it really creates an opportunity for all the other countries to also discuss how can we create a system that can also be strong enough if there are individual countries that refuse to cooperate? How can we foresee that in the way that we design the system? So it's been a very historic and very exciting process to watch. And because the negotiations are transparent, we are able to watch it. So it's been a very interesting time.
Yeah, I have another one here for you, Tova, which is what role can civil society play in pushing for greater transparency, stronger accountability, and closing offshore loopholes exposed by the Panama Papers?
Well, I mean, here I will echo Gerard a bit again, is that it's important to collaborate and cooperate globally. And this is actually a bit the mirror situation of the ICIJ. We also have in civil society, we have a global collaboration. And for example, we have the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. And what that has been is a coming together of colleagues from all around the world. And exactly also like Gerard mentioned with the journalists, is people come with the perspectives from their countries and they lead on the discussion about what needs to happen in their countries. And then we come together. And the interesting thing is that when we come together on this issue, we see that there are many differences around the world, but there are also some common problems that impact everyone. Of course, when ICIJ comes out with a global story, it's an absolute blessing for us because suddenly we all have a common reference point, and that's made it easier. But we need to collaborate globally. We need to respect that the colleagues have the leadership in their own countries. But when we come together in respect and find each other, suddenly when we start working together as a global movement, we have a much stronger impact because it really is the case here that it's not enough to have change in a handful of countries. You need a global reform. And so luckily we also learned to collaborate on the civil society side.
On the topic of collaboration, this one's back to you, Gerard. What can be done to maintain and expand public and philanthropic funding for investigative reporting?
Well, I think I think we've also seen, thanks to the Panama Papers, the growth of nonprofit journalism. I mean, it was the first time really that we had a big global story led by a nonprofit, and we've now seen some very strong and very good nonprofits rise as a result of that. Um, I think there has to be a recognition that public interest journalism needs to survive. I mentioned that the business models that were once supporting this are dying. I think we need to find a new way to maintain the kind of work that we were able to do in Panama Papers. Now, whether that's through philanthropy like we do, I mean, or we, discover some new business model that allows us to happen. I think that's probably the biggest crisis that we're facing. I think we're managing to keep those old skills going until somebody works out a future. I don't think anyone knows what the future is. I wish I knew what it was. I would make a lot of money. But I think in the meantime, in terms of how to support this, I think you've got to realize that this kind of journalism takes time, it takes money, it needs to be supported. Obviously, we're one organization that would love that kind of support. We did Panama Papers on an absolute shoestring. I mean, people cannot realize how few resources we had at the time. We were about 10 people at ICIJ at that stage. We were part of a larger nonprofit called the Center for Public Integrity. They were going broke while we were trying to do this. And we were running out of money as well as running out of time before we published. But you can see the power of what happened when you do this kind of work well. I mean, we did the entire project for about $1 million. And so far, the Panama Papers has brought in about $1.4 billion that we know of around the world. So in terms of a multiple, what you can do, that's a pretty good return. And we'd like to keep it going, obviously, which is why we'd like to do this work. I'll also say there were a lot of heroes in this. I mean, the German journalists, Bastian Obermeier and Frederick Obermeier, who came to us with the material, the Icelandic reporter, Johannes, who basically worked for free during the entire period, gave up his job so he could work with us. There were a lot of other major sacrifices made by the journalists along the way. And it really does show that, this kind of journalism works because you have journalists who are committed.
Absolutely. All right, I think that is going to be our last question. It's time to bring the panel to the close. Thank you so much, Tova. Thank you, Gerard. And thank you all, our audience, for joining us today and engaging with our work. Like Gerard said, we are a nonprofit. We're donor funded, which means we really, really do rely on your support and engagement. It's what allows us to do this kind of work, even as funding for journalism is shrinking and actors that find our reporting inconvenient are growing increasingly more powerful. So if you found our work valuable and you want to see more of it in the world today, please do consider donating. You can do that at icij.org. There you can also read the original Panama Papers stories. You can learn more about how they came together and see the impact it's had over the last 10 years. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you guys for the conversation.